Mom, we need space for the kids. That piano takes up practically an entire corner of the room, and you? You can't play the way you used to anymore. Your hands shake. We got a decent amount for it. You don't have to worry." Michael said that when I came home on Saturday afternoon, September 14th, after 3 days visiting Vera Nakamura, my old friend from our days at the Curtis Institute of Music. I had just walked into the living room and was standing looking at the right-hand corner of the wall where the black Steinway Model B had stood in this house for 3 years, since I moved in with my son and daughter-in-law. The corner was empty. No piano. Only a bright rectangular shape on the Persian rug. The impression left by the legs of the instrument in the place they had stood long enough to leave their own trace. My name is Evelyn Margaret Thornton. I am 71 years old. I have been playing the piano since I was 6. 65 years. I taught piano at the Curtis Institute of Music for 22 years. I have performed at Carnegie Hall twice, at the Kimmel Center 11 times, and in more than 300 smaller concerts throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey. That Steinway Model B, serial number from 1989, resonance board of Canadian spruce, Steinway synthetic ivory keys, was the piano that Charles bought for me on our 15th wedding anniversary, and now it was no longer there. "Michael," I said, my voice steady in the way of steadiness that requires all of one's strength to maintain, "you sold my piano." "Mom," my 49-year-old son said, his voice carrying the patience people use when speaking to someone they consider no longer sharp, "we needed to rearrange. The kids need a gaming room. That piano was taking up the space. That piano is mine. You live in our house." Diana, my daughter-in-law, the 46-year-old woman I had accepted into this family 20 years ago, stepped out of the kitchen with a prepared tone. "Mother Evelyn, we've been very patient about that piano for years. The early morning playing, the late evening playing. The kids can't sleep. The neighbors complained. And honestly." Diana paused in the way of someone who has decided to speak plainly. "You're older now. Your hands shake. What you play now isn't really music anymore. It's just noise." "Noise?" I looked at Diana in a brief silence. Then I looked at Michael, my son. The child I had placed on the piano bench when he was 4, and taught to play Twinkle, Twinkle with tiny fingers. Michael looked back at me and said nothing to contradict Diana. "The kids' gaming room will go right there," Diana said, pointing to the impression on the rug. "We've already ordered the setup. It's arriving Wednesday." I went to my room. Not fast, not slow, only because I needed to leave that space. I closed the door and sat down on the edge of the bed. The Steinway Model B. 3 years in this house. 16 years since Charles died. I had played it every day the way people speak to someone they love and can no longer speak to in the ordinary way. I played Schubert in the morning, Brahms in the afternoon, Chopin when I missed Charles particularly, and now it was gone, sold to make room for a gaming screen. Sunday morning, I asked Michael more about the piano, not because I hadn't understood what happened, but because I wanted to hear him say more. "How much did you get for it?" I asked. Michael looked into his coffee cup. $12,000. A Steinway Model B in good condition, with a vintage serial number from 1989. Market value between $35,000 and $45,000. Michael had sold it for $12,000. "Where did the money go?" I asked. Paid down some credit card debt. He said that with the voice of someone explaining something ordinary. Mom, we're really working hard to keep the family going. The mortgage, the kids' tuition, insurance. Michael, I raised you alone from the time you were 13 after your father died, and I managed. But you sold my property without asking me. Not because I needed the money, because you wanted the money. You live in our house, he repeated, that sentence like a final card that ends every argument. I don't need your house, I said. The first time I had said out loud what I had been thinking all night. I don't need to be here if being here means the thing I love most is called noise and sold to buy a gaming screen. Michael looked at me with an expression that hadn't expected that. What will you do? You're 71. No other income besides a small pension. I'll figure something out, I said. And that time I said it not because I knew what that would be, but because I needed to hear myself say it. I was born in 1953 in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, the second daughter of a family with 3 generations of musical tradition. My grandfather played violin in the church orchestra. My father played cello as an amateur. My mother was the only one without a musical ear, but she bought me my first upright piano when I was 6, using 6 months of savings from giving needlework lessons. I still remember the day the piano was brought into the house. 2 large men carrying a brown Wurlitzer into the small living room and setting it in the corner beside the window. I stood watching and felt something move in my chest in a way that I would only later know to name: longing. Miss Harriet Moore, the 50-year-old black woman who lived at the far end of Germantown Avenue, a student of U.B. Blake, taught me piano every Wednesday and Friday for 10 years. She didn't teach in the traditional conservatory style. She taught by listening. Evelyn, she would say, you're not playing the right notes. You're playing the right feeling. The notes are only the vehicle for the feeling to travel from inside you to outside. I carried that sentence with me my entire life. At 16, I was accepted into Curtis Institute of Music's Young Artist program, one of the most rigorous music schools in the world, where full scholarships are the standard. I was the only person from Germantown's public high school accepted to Curtis that year. My father cried when he heard the news. Not much. He was not someone who displayed his feelings easily. Only 2 small tears at the corners of his eyes when he read the acceptance letter. Evelyn, he said, this is what the whole family has been preparing for, without knowing it was preparing. I met Charles Thornton at 25 in 1978 at a small concert at the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He was not a musician. He was an architect, a gentleman with attentive eyes in the way of someone who actually listens rather than waiting for his turn to speak. You played Ravel that evening, he said when we talked after the concert. Valses nobles et sentimentales. I don't know a great deal about music, but I knew you were saying something important with your hands. People often ask how I, a musician, could fall in love with someone who didn't play. I tend to say, Charles didn't play music, but he listened to it in a way that few people do. He listened not to assess technique, but to receive what the player was trying to convey. That kind of person is rare. We married in 1981. Michael was born in 1975, before we were married, with another man. Charles knew about Michael before we married and said, "Michael is your son, which means he'll be mine." He kept that promise for 20 years until he died. In 1996, on our 15th wedding anniversary, Charles ordered a Steinway Model B for me. He didn't tell me in advance. On the morning of our anniversary, 2 men knocked at the door and carried the gleaming black piano into the living room. I stood looking at it and couldn't speak for a moment. The Steinway Model B, Steinway's mid-size grand piano, the instrument of intimate recitals and high-caliber recording sessions. "Charles," I said, "this piano." "I know," he said, "but you deserve it. You've always deserved it." Charles died in 2008 from pancreatic cancer, the kind the doctors discovered in the final stage, and in 6 months from diagnosis to death. I played the piano every evening so he could hear it from his hospital bed. Schubert, Brahms, Bach, Chopin. The last night before Charles died, I played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece he always requested. When the music ended, I turned and saw him sleeping with the most peaceful expression I had seen on his face in many months. He died at 4 a.m, in his sleep, in silence. From then on, I played the Steinway every day, not because I was still a performing artist. I had retired from Curtis in 2015, but because it was how I continued the conversation with Charles, with Harriet Moore, with my father, and with all those who had been part of my musical life and were no longer here. Diana called that noise. I moved in with Michael and Diana in 2021, after a fall at home, where I lay on the floor for several hours before a neighbor found me. I wasn't seriously hurt, but enough so that Michael said living alone was no longer safe. I agreed, and I brought the Steinway with me, the one thing I wasn't willing to leave behind. The house in Chestnut Hill belonged to Michael and Diana. I lived in the upstairs bedroom, shared the common living areas. My room was comfortable enough materially, but had no truly private space of my own, except the Steinway, which Michael had allowed to stand in the living room as a concession. A concession. My piano in the house where I was living as a guest, kept as a concession. I played in the early morning before the children woke, and in the evening after they were in bed. Diana had mentioned noise several times, and I had adjusted my playing schedule to accommodate her. I had been making myself smaller to fit the space people had allotted me. Now the piano was gone, and the living room was about to have a gaming screen. I had made myself small enough. When I moved in 2021, everything was normal in the ordinary sense of family life. The 2 grandchildren, Liam, 10, and Emma, 8, used to climb up and sit beside me when I played. Emma once asked, "Grandma, how do you know to press the right keys without looking?" I explained about muscle memory and how hands learn over years. But things gradually changed. Diana began expressing complaints about the evening playing. The kids have trouble sleeping. Michael began talking about optimizing the living space. The Steinway went from a family asset in the first year to Mom's piano in the second year, and the big piano taking up room in the third. I adjusted. No playing after 9 at night. No playing before 7 in the morning. No playing on weekend mornings. The permitted playing window narrowed with each small adjustment, and I allowed this to happen, not because I didn't notice, but because I noticed in the way of someone gradually accustoming themselves to the situation. Each step of reduction small enough to seem reasonable, until looking back, I could see how far I'd gone. Curtis Institute of Music sits on Locust Street in Philadelphia, in an old mansion building from the late 19th century. When I walked through its doors for the first time at 19 in the fall of 1971, its smell, old wood and rosin, and the air of a place where music had soaked into every wall across decades, was a smell I would never forget. My professor at Curtis was Eleanor Blake, a 60-year-old Boston-born woman, a student of Rudolf Serkin. Blake was not an easy teacher in the conventional sense. When she approved, it was by saying nothing more after you played, and her students understood that silence was better than any praise. The most important lesson Blake taught me was not about technique. It was about the artist's responsibility to the music. "The piece doesn't belong to you," she said in a second-year lesson. "You are the one the music has entrusted with conveying it. Your job is not to prove how good you are. It is to faithfully convey what the composer meant to say." I carried that lesson through my entire career. When I play Chopin, I am not playing as Evelyn Thornton playing Chopin. I play as the person Chopin has entrusted to speak what he wanted to say through those notes. The performer's self doesn't disappear, but it serves the music, not the other way around. In my third year at Curtis, after hearing me play Brahms' Intermezzo Opus 118 No. 2, Blake said, "That was the first time you weren't trying to play Brahms. You were simply playing." That was the best praise I received in 4 years at Curtis. I graduated in 1975 and was invited to stay and teach for 2 years. Then 2 years became 3, became 10, became 28 years. And not because I lacked performance opportunities. I continued performing alongside teaching, but because teaching was different from performing, and both were necessary for me to feel I was doing my full work. 28 years of teaching at Curtis, from 1978 to 2006, were 28 years standing on both sides of music. The artist side when I performed, and the teacher side when I watched others learn. Teaching at Curtis was different from teaching at most other places, because the students there didn't need to be convinced that music mattered. They already knew that. What they needed to learn was something more subtle: how to move from technique to expression, how to let the music speak through their hands rather than only be reproduced by them. I had a student named Wei Chen, Taiwanese, 18 years old, technically flawless to a frightening degree. He could play any piece with perfect precision and complete emotional detachment. The first time he played for me, I sat in silence for a moment after the music ended. "Wei," I said, "you just played a technically perfect piece, and it wasn't remarkable at all." He looked at me, not angry, just surprised. "Why?" "Because you're translating a language, not speaking it. You know where the notes are and your hands go to the right place, but you haven't let the music pass through you. You're stopping it at technique." Wei Chen took 6 months to understand what I meant, and when he finally did, the first time he played and I heard something in the sound that wasn't in the printed score, I knew he had crossed that threshold. Wei Chen now performs internationally. When he heard I had won the Heritage Prize, he called and said only, "I know you're still speaking that language." That was the most accurate compliment I received. What teaching left in me was not a list of successful students, though I am proud of them. What it left was this understanding. When you truly teach someone something, you cannot take it back. It belongs to them. And conversely, when someone truly teaches you, that belongs to you forever, whether the teacher is still living or not. In my 28 years at Curtis, I taught more than 100 piano students. Not all of them became professional performers. Curtis doesn't promise that, and that isn't the only measure of success. But every person who went through that program carried something that was not only technique. The first student I taught at Curtis was a 17-year-old from Pittsburgh named Marcus Webb, African American, the son of a pastor, whose father had knocked on many doors to get his son a scholarship to Philadelphia. Marcus had raw talent, but rawer technique. What was remarkable about him was the way he listened to music. He listened with his whole body, not only his ears. In the first 2 years, Marcus and I worked mainly on basic technique, the fundamentals that many Curtis students arrived with already. But Marcus hadn't had the chance to learn properly. In the 3rd year, when the technique had stabilized, he began to play in a way I hadn't taught and couldn't teach, his own way. Marcus Webb is now a professor at Oberlin Conservatory and performs occasionally in the eastern United States. He called when he heard about the Heritage competition and said, "Professor Thornton, you taught me that technique isn't the destination. It's only the road. Now I see you're still on that road." The second student I want to mention is Sarah Okonkwo, a Nigerian-American woman who came to Curtis at 21, older than most, saying that she had come to piano late and entered Curtis through an unconventional path. A Philadelphia professor heard her play at a church service and called the Curtis admissions office directly. Sarah had something I couldn't explain in technical language. Whenever she played, the listeners fell silent in a different way. Not the silence of impressive technique or of a familiar piece, but the silence of people hearing something they hadn't heard in that way before. Sarah Okonkwo is now one of the most important performing pianists of her generation in America. When she was interviewed recently about her career influences, and she said, "Professor Thornton at Curtis taught me that there's no single right way to play a piece, only the most honest way." Marcus and Sarah and Wei Chen and dozens of others. That is what I truly left from 28 years at Curtis. Not my performances, not the prizes, but the people who passed through my classroom and carried a part of what I believed about music. Monday, September 16th, early morning. While the house was still asleep, I called Vera Nakamura. Vera was my friend from our Curtis years, a 69-year-old Japanese-American woman who had taught music theory at Curtis until retiring in 2020. Vera lived alone in Rittenhouse Square, played piano every day, and was the only person I knew who understood music the way I understood it. "Evelyn," Vera said when I told her, "you can't let this be where it ends." "It's already happened, Vera. I mean, what comes next? You cannot let this be the end of the story." "I don't have money for a new piano. I have nowhere to put one." "Evelyn," Vera interrupted me. "Do you remember when you were 22 and nobody believed you could get into Curtis? What did you do?" "I played," I said after a moment. "Exactly. You played. Same thing now." But first you have to find something to play on. Vera told me about the Philadelphia Public Library system. Many branches of the Free Library of Philadelphia had public pianos for residents to use at no charge, and some branches had small practice rooms with grand pianos. And Evelyn, look up this name, the Philadelphia Senior Musicianship Prize, organized by the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society, an online music competition for musicians over 60. This year's submission deadline is Friday, September 27th. First prize is $15,000 and a performance contract at the Kimmel Center. I sat with that information. Vera, I don't have a piano to record on. The Logan Square branch has a practice room with a Yamaha grand piano. Book the room and record there. My hands aren't what they were. What did Harriet Moore teach you? I knew Vera would ask that. I'm not playing the right notes. I'm playing the right feeling. Exactly. So tomorrow morning, you go to Logan Square Library. You book a practice room, and you play. Tuesday morning, September 17th, I arrived at the Logan Square branch of the Free Library at 9 o'clock when the doors opened. The person in charge of the music room was Marcus Cole, around 30, who had studied music at Temple University. When I explained that I needed a practice room to record a competition submission, he asked, "Who are you in Philadelphia music?" "I taught at Curtis for 22 years, I said. Marcus straightened up. "Mrs. Thornton? Evelyn Thornton? I studied music under someone who studied under you, Dr. James Lawson at Temple." James Lawson was a fine student. He had a rare gift with Debussy. Marcus led me to practice room 3, a small room with acoustic walls, a black Yamaha C3 grand piano, a recording microphone on a stand, and natural light through a small high window. I sat down at the bench. I placed my hands on the keys. The hands of a 71-year-old woman with somewhat swollen joints and fingers that sometimes trembled lightly when the weather changed. When the hands had warmed and the joints had loosened, the sound from the Yamaha C3 came out in the way I recognized as right, not flawless in the way of a young artist, but with something else. The depth of someone who had played this music many times across many decades. I decided to play Schubert's Piano Sonata in a major, D664, the piece that Harriet Moore called the piece you were born to play. In 3 hours that morning, I didn't record. I only played, playing to confirm for myself that Diana was wrong. Music is not determined by whether hands shake or not. Music is something you carry in yourself, and no one can take it. The what teaching 30 years left behind, not only in the students I recall, but in the understanding it built in me, is something I want to describe honestly, because it shaped how I approached the recording sessions at Logan Square as much as anything else. Harriet Moore had taught me that notes are the vehicle, not the destination. I passed that on at Curtis, and the students who understood it most deeply carried it back to me when I needed to remember Wei Chen's telephone call, Marcus Webb's words about still walking the road, Sarah Okonkwo's description of the most honest way. When I sat at the Yamaha C3 at Logan Square on that first Tuesday morning, I was not performing for a panel of judges. I was simply playing for Harriet Moore and Charles and my father and the accumulated weight of 65 years of knowing what music is for, what it had always been for. The students I taught are themselves now teaching. The lessons I received from Blake and from Harriet Moore are in people I have never met, in cities I have never visited. That is what teaching does. It multiplies what cannot be contained in a single life. I retired from Curtis in 2015, not because of health, but because I wanted time to play for myself. Not performing, not teaching, but simply playing. Ironically, the very thing I retired to have more time for was then taken by a sold piano and a daughter-in-law who called it noise. In the 9 days from Tuesday the 17th to Friday the 26th of September, I went to Logan Square Library every morning. Marcus booked practice room 3 for me from 9 to noon. On the 5th day, Marcus knocked on the practice room door and stood listening while I finished the middle movement of the Schubert Sonata before saying anything. "Mrs. Thornton, this is something rare. What you're playing isn't technique. It's something else. I've heard many younger artists play Schubert with more technically perfect execution, but not with what you're doing here." "What is that?" I asked. "Real life," he said simply. "Schubert wrote this sonata at 21, but its full meaning can only be heard when the person playing it has lived enough." I recorded the Schubert Piano Sonata in a major, D664, all 3 movements, on the 7th day. Marcus helped me position the microphone correctly, and after listening to the recording, said, "Send this file. You don't need to change anything." I submitted my entry on Friday the 27th of September in the late afternoon, 2 hours before the deadline. In the 9 days I spent at the library, Marcus and I talked more than I expected. He told me about his own musical education. His family had no money for private music schools, and he had learned through public scholarship programs and city support. "This is why the library matters," he said. "Not just books. The piano here is free. Someone like me without the library, no music." I thought of Harriet Moore when he said that. She taught me not because she was generously compensated. My parents paid her less than she deserved. She taught because music had to be passed on, because children from Germantown had as much right to music as children from wealthier neighborhoods. On my last day at the library before submitting, Marcus came in with a piece of paper. "Mrs. Thornton, I wanted to show you this." It was a printout of the competition's website, the prize description section, with a line I hadn't noticed. "Winner will also receive invitation to perform at the annual Curtis Institute Alumni Concert." Curtis Institute Alumni Concert, the place where I had taught for 22 years. "I didn't know that," I said. "I found it reading more carefully," Marcus said. "Thought you'd want to know." I looked at the page and thought, if I win this competition, I'll return to Curtis not as a retired professor, but as a musician. A small distinction to an outsider, but a significant one to me. Sunday, September 29th. At 3 p.m, I received a letter from the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society. "Dear Miss Thornton, we are delighted to inform you that you have been selected as the first prize winner of the 2024 Philadelphia Senior Musicianship Prize." I read that sentence and read it again, then read it a third time, because when you have been waiting 71 years for something, when it actually arrives, the mind needs a moment to confirm that the eyes have read correctly. First prize, $15,000, and a performance contract at the Kimmel Center, the same stage where Charles had sat watching me play, and after each performance had brought me a bouquet of white roses. I sat in my room and cried, not from sadness, but because there are moments when emotions don't distinguish between joy and grief, and only feeling strong enough that the body has no other way to process it. I called Vera. Vera, I won. Vera was silent for 3 seconds. Then, of course you won. What did Harriet Moore teach you? I'm not playing the right notes, I said, my voice half crying, half laughing. I'm playing the right feeling. Exactly, Vera said. And now we talk about the next step. In the first week of October, I met James Wheeler, the executive director of the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society, at the Kimmel Center. Mrs. Thornton, the panel received more than 200 submissions. Yours was the only one all 3 judges agreed on immediately. Not because of the best technique, I said directly. Not because of the best technique, he agreed, but because your submission sounded like real music, like someone saying what they need to say. The performance contract included 3 concerts in the winter season. Beyond the $15,000 in prize money, the 3 performances brought an additional $9,000, a total of $24,000, enough for an apartment deposit and to buy a piano. In the week of October 14th, I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Center City, Philadelphia, on Pine Street, 4 blocks from Rittenhouse Square. Vera came with me, and when we walked in, the first thing she did was go to the window. Good light. A piano needs light. November. 3 weeks after I moved out of Michael's house, Michael called me. That surprised me because in the 3 years I had lived there, Michael and I had not had many direct one-on-one conversations. Mom, he began, I want to apologize for the piano. I've been thinking about it since I read the article, Michael continued. I explained to myself afterward about the piano and what it meant to you. I didn't know that before, not because nobody said it. I think because I wasn't listening well enough. Michael, I only have one question. Why didn't you ask before doing it? There was a long pause. Because we assumed you didn't need it anymore, and that assumption didn't ask. Something more genuine was in his voice. That was our mistake. Then I said, Michael, not everything that can be quantified is unimportant. I said that not to lecture, but because it was the truest thing I could say to a person who had lived his whole life by measurement and formula. Michael was quiet for a moment. I understand. I didn't know whether he genuinely understood, in the sense of changing his thinking, not just accepting what he had just heard. But that phone call was something both of us needed. I told Michael that evening, Wednesday the 16th of October. I'll be moving out at the end of November, I said during dinner. Where will you go? Michael asked. I've rented an apartment in Center City. I've also just won first prize at the Philadelphia Senior Musicianship Prize and a performance contract at the Kimmel Center. The dinner table went quiet. You didn't tell me anything about this competition. No, I didn't say anything, because I don't need your permission, and because I had spent too many years asking your permission for things that belong to me. Mom, Michael said after a moment, his voice lower, I know you're angry about the piano. I should have asked you. Yes, you should have asked me. Can you forgive me? I am your mother. I will always be your mother. But forgiveness and forgetting are two different things. And forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the same circumstances. I continued, Michael, this decision isn't a punishment for you. This is me choosing to live in a way that's true to who I am. I need my own space. I need morning music that no one calls noise. The second place winner at the Heritage Piano Competition that year was an 83-year-old woman from Vienna, Austria. Her name was Ingrid Schreiber, who had been a piano professor at the Universität für Musik Wien for 40 years. She sent me an email 2 weeks after the results were announced. Dear Mrs. Thornton, I listened to your submission many times, not because you won, but because the way you played Chopin reminded me of something I taught students for 40 years, but find increasingly rare: honesty in music. You were not playing to prove anything. You were playing because you had something to say. In professional musical circles, that grows rare. Congratulations to you, and thank you for reminding me. I read that email many times that evening, not because it made me proud, but because it confirmed something I had believed, but sometimes doubted. Truly great music recognizes itself across borders and languages and ages and circumstances. Harriet Moore taught me my first lesson about music when I was 6. Ingrid Schreiber from Vienna reminded me of that lesson when I was 71. The circle never closes. It continues. I moved out on November 22nd. Vera helped me with her car. 2 small carloads were enough. The most important things: music books and scores from 60 years, Harriet Moore's handwritten notes from the childhood lessons, the photograph of Charles and me standing outside the Kimmel Center after a 2003 performance, and a small blue box holding Charles's odds and ends, including a small folded note in his handwriting. E plays Schubert like she knows what he meant. On November 25th, I bought a Yamaha C3X at the Sailor Piano Dealer on Chestnut Street. The price after negotiation was $18,500. Vera stood beside me when the piano was brought into the apartment. It's not Charles's Steinway, I said. It's not Charles's Steinway, Vera agreed, but it's Evelyn's piano. This one is yours, chosen by you, bought by you. I sat down at the bench, placed my hands on the keys, and played. Not to record, not to perform, only because this was my home and I could play whenever I wanted. The first performance took place on December 14th in the small concert room of the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society, an intimate space that seats about 80 people. Vera sat in the front row. Marcus Cole arrived unasked. He had heard the news and wanted to come. James Wheeler introduced me and closed with, Mrs. Thornton has demonstrated that genuine music has no age. I walked onto the stage, sat at the piano bench, looked at the white keys and the stage light, placed my hands, the hands of a 71-year-old woman with somewhat swollen joints and fingers that sometimes trembled when the weather changed. And I played Schubert's Piano Sonata in a major, D664, the piece Harriet Moore called the piece you were born to play, the piece Charles used to ask for on evenings when he wanted to sit and listen in silence. And when I finished the piece, and the last piano note dissolved into the air of the concert room, the 80 people in that space held their silence for 3 additional seconds before beginning to applaud. 3 seconds of silence after the music ends. That was what Harriet Moore used to say. was the true sign of good music. After the performance, Michael came to find me alone, without Diana. I hadn't invited him. He came on his own. "Mom," he said, for the first time in many months, his voice sounded like the voice of someone speaking to another person as an equal. "You played beautifully." "Thank you," I said. "I've been listening to you play since I was little, but tonight was the first time I really listened." He paused. I didn't know that I hadn't been listening. "Michael, I love you. That doesn't change. But loving you doesn't mean I have to give up the things that make me who I am." "I understand that now," he said. "I hope you do. Not for my sake, but for your own. Because someday, when you are older, and something important to you is dismissed by others as unnecessary, you'll remember tonight." The second performance, at the Kimmel Center proper, took place in late January. Verizon Hall with more than 2,400 seats. I had performed here 11 times in my career, but this time was different. The first time I stood on this stage as something other than what I had been before, the 71-year-old woman who had been told her music was only noise, standing 4 months later before 2,400 people. Vera was in row 3. Marcus Cole stood in the back standing section. And in row 12, I recognized familiar faces, Michael and Diana. Grandchildren Liam and Emma sat beside their parents, Emma in a red dress looking around with an expression of intense curiosity. I hadn't invited them, but when I saw them in the hall, Michael and Diana and the 2 children sitting there, waiting to hear me play, I felt something that was a not satisfaction at having proved a point, but more complicated, the hope that this evening would say something to them that conversations couldn't say. I played Brahms's Intermezzo in a major opus 118 number 2, the piece Charles used to place alongside Schubert as 2 of his most beloved. When the music dissolved into the air of Verizon Hall, the audience was silent, not polite silence, the silence of 2,400 people who were all in the same place at the same time. 4 seconds. Then the applause. And in row 12, I saw Emma, the 8-year-old granddaughter who had once asked me why I knew to press the right keys without looking, stand up and begin clapping before any of the adults around her. That is the moment I will remember longest. Not the applause of the whole hall, but Emma standing and clapping before everyone else. The first Philadelphia winter in the new apartment, from December through February, is something I want to describe. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because it speaks to something important about life when you get to live it on your own terms. I woke every morning at 6, made coffee, sat at the window for 15 minutes looking at the park, then sat at the Yamaha and played for an hour and a half before attending to anything else in the day. No one complained about the sound. No one said that corner needed to be a gaming room for anyone. What I hadn't understood before was that the freedom to play was not only the physical freedom to access an instrument, it was the psychological freedom to play without feeling that you were intruding on someone else's space. In 3 years at Michael's, I had played, but I had played in the manner of someone playing in another person's space, conscious of time, of volume, of whether I was being an imposition. Those small calculations accumulated across years had become a thin pane of glass between me and the music. At Rittenhouse Square, that glass was gone. The first winter morning when I played Debussy's Clair de Lune in my own apartment, No one listening but me and the morning light through the window, and the pale Philadelphia sky of a day that might bring snow. I recognized that this was the way I had played before any pressure or expectation existed. When I was a 5-year-old sitting at my grandmother's old upright, I played because there was no other reason than that the music was the best thing in my world. 66 years later, it was still the best thing in my world. One of the things I didn't anticipate when I moved into the Rittenhouse Square apartment was my music became part of the building, not in the sense of disturbing anyone. I didn't play late, and the Yamaha C3X is not as large as the Steinway, but in the sense that the people in the building began recognizing the sound and beginning to notice it. Mrs. Nguyen on the 4th floor, a 75-year-old Vietnamese woman living alone since her husband died the previous year, knocked on my door in my 2nd week there. She brought a box of cookies and said, "I hear you playing every morning. The music is so beautiful. I don't know classical music, but I can hear what it does inside me." We had tea and cookies for an hour. Mrs. Nguyen told me about her husband, an engineer who used to sing old songs while washing dishes. I told her about Charles and the Steinway and the new Yamaha, 2 older women living alone at Rittenhouse Square, talking about the men they had lost and what remained. Marcus, the sound technician at the Kimmel Center, ran into me in the building hallway 3 months after I moved in. It turned out he lived on the 5th floor. "You live here?" He was surprised. "I moved in last October," I said. "I've been hearing piano music in the mornings," Marcus said. "Didn't know who was playing. Now I do." Music finds its way to listeners through paths that cannot be planned. I didn't know that when I began playing in the Rittenhouse Square apartment, but it happened. And now, every morning when I play, I know that not only I am hearing what I play, After moving to the apartment, I received an email from Wei Chen, the former Curtis student I described earlier, who now performs internationally. He had heard the news about heritage and wrote, "Professor Thornton, I remember the lesson when you told me I was translating a language instead of speaking it. I didn't understand immediately. It took 6 months. Now every time I sit at the piano, I think about that sentence. I heard your competition submission and knew you are still speaking, not translating. I know you are still speaking that language." I read Wei's email and thought about that lesson 25 years ago, the young student with perfect technique and an unopened heart. Teaching is not the transmission of knowledge. It is planting seeds without knowing when they will germinate. And sometimes the seeds germinate 25 years later, and only then does the one who planted them know. 28 years of teaching at Curtis taught me this. The real work of a teacher never ends when the class ends. It continues in the people who learned and carried what they learned into their own work and lives. In April, the final performance of the contract took place at the Curtis Institute itself, the alumni concert. Field Concert Hall at Curtis holds about 400 people, but it gave me the particular feeling of coming back. These walls had heard me play since I was 16. In the audience were many of my former students. Sarah Kim had flown in from Portland, booking her own flight. I didn't know until I walked out and saw her in the front row. James Lawson sat beside Sarah and nodded when he saw me. And in a corner of the room, standing because there were no empty seats, was Marcus Cole. I played 3 pieces that evening: Schubert, Brahms, And finally, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the last piece I had played for Charles the night before he died. When I finished the Nocturne and sat still with my hand still on the keys, I heard nothing for a few seconds. Then Sarah Kim began to applaud. Then James Lawson. Then the whole room. And in the applause, I heard what was not ordinary applause. I heard Harriet Moore saying, "You're not playing the right notes. You're playing the right feeling." That's right. 71 years old, 65 years of playing. Hands that sometimes shake, and still the right feeling. I want to say more about why I chose Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9 No. 2 for the competition, because that wasn't a random choice, and not only because I knew the piece well. Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9 No. 2 was the piece I played for the first time at 14, when my grandmother Miriam began teaching me more complex pieces after 9 years of learning the fundamentals. She sat beside me throughout that lesson, not to correct technique, only to sit and listen. When I finished playing the first time, she cried. I asked, "Grandma, are you all right?" She wiped her eyes and said, "I'm fine. I just heard something in your playing that I haven't heard in any student before." What was it? You're playing as though you're speaking to someone specific, not playing because of the piece. I didn't understand what she meant at 14, and I was only trying to play the right notes at the right tempo. But she heard something I didn't know I was doing, and that sentence stayed with me. When I played Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9 No. 2 at the competition, I knew who I was speaking to. My grandmother Miriam had died in 1995, the same year Charles bought the Steinway, as though the things that leave and the things that arrive balance each other in some way. Charles died in 2008. The students I had taught and who had taught me back the things I had taught them, and people who didn't know music but needed to hear it. The music is the longest conversation I have, longer than any conversation in words. And Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9 No. 2 is the piece my grandmother Miriam heard me play and cried and said I was speaking to someone. I played it for the competition because I wanted to continue that conversation. Late in 2024, the Heritage Piano Competition sent me a letter inviting me to participate on the jury panel for next year's competition, not as a contestant, but as a senior judge in an advisory and evaluative role for the other older artists. I read the letter twice and sat with it for a while. Then I replied, I accepted, but with a condition. I would continue participating as a contestant if the competition opened its categories without age limits for artists over 70. Otherwise, I would only serve on the jury. The organizers replied in 2 days, "We're considering expanding the categories. We'll be in touch." I didn't know where that would lead, but I knew I had asked the right question, and not can I participate, but why is there a limit? And what purpose does that limit serve? Music has no expiration date, and the capacity for expression does not end at a specific numerical age. And those who have devoted a lifetime to learning a craft, any craft, have something to offer that the young, however talented, cannot yet have. The depth of lived experience transformed into art. This story is not a story of revenge or triumph or proving someone wrong. It is a story of a 71-year-old woman reclaiming what had always been hers. If you are reading this and you are a younger person living with elderly parents, or have elderly parents who need a place to stay. I want to say one honest thing. The things most important to older people are not always the things you can see. Sometimes it's the piano they play every morning. Sometimes it's the small garden they tend themselves. Sometimes it's the chair they sit in reading every afternoon. Those small things are not furniture. They are how the person speaks to the world, how they continue to be themselves. When you take those things away, whatever reasonable reason you might have, you are not only taking an object, you are telling them, I see that you no longer need this. And sometimes that simply isn't true. If you are reading this and you are an older adult in a situation like mine, the things that matter to you are being compressed. Your space is slowly disappearing, and you are wondering whether you are still yourself. I want to say, what you know how to do and love to do, no one can take away. People can take the piano. No one can take the music. People can compress your space. No one can compress you unless you allow them. And the most important thing I want to say, something I learned from the cardboard box and Charles's note, is that real love is love that prepares. The people who truly love you don't only stand beside you when things are fine. They look ahead and think, if someday you no longer have this, here. That is the thing I want to honor and carry. And finally, what my grandmother Miriam taught me at 5 years old, and which took me 66 years to fully understand. Music is the last language remaining when all other languages have been silenced. My grandmother said that in the context of someone who had lost everything and carried only one thing that couldn't be taken. But it applies to everyone in every circumstance. The things that truly belong to you, skills, knowledge, the way you speak and think and feel. No one can take those. Those are the things to protect and nurture and continue to use, not simply to preserve. There is something I want to say to Diana that I never found the right moment and right way to say. I'm writing it here not to criticize or to be misunderstood, but because it is true and important. Diana is intelligent and capable and loves her family in her way. She brought me into their home because she was worried and because she didn't want me to be alone after Charles died. Those things are real, and I don't deny them. But there is something she, and perhaps many adult children in similar circumstances, hasn't understood. Bringing a parent home to live with you is not giving that parent a better life if you simultaneously take away the things that are essential to who that parent is. Giving me shelter and food, but taking away the piano, or anything that is central to my identity, isn't care. It's management. Older people don't only need a place to live and food to eat. They need to continue being the person they have been, with their passions, their skills, the things that give them a reason to get up in the morning. Taking those things away, however good the intention, takes away an important part of who that person is. What I want to say to Diana, not as reproach but as information from my experience, if you want to truly care for a parent, ask them what matters most to them. Not once, but regularly, because the answer can change. And when they name what matters, even if it seems inconvenient or doesn't fit easily into your household, trust that answer. For me, what mattered most was the piano. For someone else, it might be the garden, or the wood shop, or the knitting corner, or whatever they have given the time and love and energy of their life to. Those things are not hobbies or pastimes in the light sense. They are the language the person uses to speak to the world, to memory, to themselves. And no one has the right to take away that language without asking, whether they are adult children, whether they are worried, whether they are trying to do good. In March, Diana came to visit me at the Rittenhouse Square apartment for the first time since I had moved out. Not a ceremonial visit. She called to ask if I wanted her to come, and I said yes. She came alone on a Saturday morning, bringing pastries from the bakery I used to buy from when I lived on Spruce Street. Almond croissants, the kind Charles and I used to eat on Sunday mornings. We sat at my small kitchen table with coffee and pastries and said little for the first 15 minutes. The window looked out on the neighboring rooftop and a pale blue strip of March morning sky. Then Diana looked toward the Yamaha in the corner of the living room and said, "Could you play something?" I looked at her. "You want to hear?" "I want to hear you play. I can't remember the last time you played for me." I stood and sat at the Yamaha, and Diana settled on the small sofa, the same chair Tyler uses on Saturdays, and faced me. I played Schumann's Kinderscenen, Scenes from Childhood, the set of short pieces depicting childhood memories as seen through the eyes of someone who has grown. I had played this set many times on evenings when Deanna was little, not to teach, just playing in the living room while she played with her toys or read. When I finished, Diana sat quietly for a moment. "You used to play this when I was little. I didn't know the name, but I remembered the sound." "Schumann's Kinderscenen," I said. "He wrote this set remembering his own childhood." Diana nodded. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "Mom, I'm sorry. Not only about the piano, or not just about the piano. I'm sorry that for 3 years I let you live in a way I thought was good for you, instead of asking what you needed. I wasn't listening." I looked at my daughter-in-law, the 43-year-old woman sitting on the small sofa with her coffee cup, and the expression of someone saying something difficult, and felt something I hadn't felt in many years: connection. "I hear you," I said, "and thank you for saying it." We sat for another 2 hours. I played a few more short pieces at Diana's request. The Chopin she remembered from childhood, the Ravel she had heard me perform the first time when she was 10. She listened in a way I hadn't seen her listen in many years, not out of politeness or duty, but genuinely. Perhaps it had begun when Tyler came home after the Kimmel Center concert and said he wanted to learn piano. Perhaps it began with the article in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Perhaps it began before that, slower and quieter, in the way true changes often begin, not from a single dramatic moment, but from the accumulation of many small ones. What I know is, on that March morning, in the small Rittenhouse Square apartment with the window overlooking the neighboring rooftop, and the Yamaha in the corner, and almond croissants on the kitchen table, my daughter-in-law and I were sitting in the same space in the truest sense, not only physically, but in terms of presence. When spring came to Philadelphia in March, I was writing these final pages of this brief memoir, sitting at the table by the window with a cup of coffee and the morning light over Rittenhouse Square Park. The April performance at Settlement Music School was approaching, the second under the Heritage contract. I was preparing a new program, Not the Kimmel Center program, but a new one with pieces I hadn't performed publicly in many years. Not because I wanted novelty for its own sake, but because there are pieces I have been keeping, waiting for the right moment, waiting until I was ready to say what those pieces needed said. Settlement Music School is where my grandmother Miriam taught in her early years when she first came to America. Playing there in April was something I approached with a feeling that can only be called by one word: worthy. Not worthy in the sense of pride or self-congratulation, but worthy in the sense that the things I have learned, the people who taught me, the years I taught others, all of it led here. To sitting at the table by the window with a cup of coffee in the Philadelphia spring sky and the piano in the corner of the room ready for any morning I want to play. Music is never something anyone can fully take away from you. People can take the instrument, people can take the space, people can say you no longer need it or no longer can. But what has entered you across 66 years of music and love and learning that no one can take? My grandmother Miriam knew that when she left Warsaw carrying one ring and a knowledge of music. I knew it when I sat at the Bosendorfer in the church music room on that September morning, and Tyler, my 9-year-old grandson, sitting on the small sofa in the Rittenhouse Square apartment every Saturday listening, is beginning to know it in his own way. That is enough, more than enough. I write these words on a January morning, sitting in the apartment on Pine Street with a cup of tea and the slanted winter Philadelphia light falling through the window onto the Yamaha C3X. Outside the small balcony, Pine Street is waking up with the smell of toast from the bakery on the corner. I'll play the piano when I finish this cup of tea, not because of a performance schedule, but because this is my morning and my piano, and no one calls what I play noise. There are things I want to say, not as a moral lesson, but as the true account of a 71-year-old person. The first concerns what Diana called my shaking hands. My hands do shake, lightly, in the way of stiff joints. That does not prevent me from playing. It makes me play differently, less focused on technical speed, more focused on the meaning of each individual note. 71 years of life have not blurred my music. They have deepened the layers of meaning I am able to convey. The second concerns invisibility. I made myself invisible over 3 years in Michael and Diana's house, adjusting to other space. Older people tend to do that, accustomed to the thinking that as you age you need less, you should diminish. That thinking is wrong. Needing fewer material things does not mean needing less meaning. The third concerns Harriet Moore. She died in 1997. But the sentence she taught me from the time I was 10 is still the most important sentence in this entire story. A great teacher doesn't only teach technique. They teach a way of seeing. And those teachers remain inside you long past their physical presence. And the final thing, music is not something you play for others to evaluate. Music is something you play because something inside you needs to be said, and ordinary language is not enough. When people take away your instrument, they don't take that. They only take the tool. The thing inside you is still there, waiting to find the next piano. I finish the cup of tea, sit at the bench. The January light falls on the Yamaha's ivory keys. And I, Evelyn Margaret Thornton, 71 years old, someone who has been playing for 65 years and is not finished, place my hands on the keys and begin. Schubert, for Charles, for Harriet Moore, for my father and the 2 small tears at the corners of his eyes, for myself. My music is for those who know how to listen with the heart.